Samantha Owen sank into her seat in 7C, her travel-worn body grateful for the cramped, recycled air comfort of the Boeing 737. She had just survived a whirlwind week of meetings in New York, her muscles aching from airports, trains, and the relentless march of business calls. Her carry-on bag jammed stubbornly under the seat ahead, spilling a water bottle and crumpled papers across the floor as she tried to wedge it in. Around her, the cabin buzzed with the low hum of conversation, the rustle of snack bags, and the occasional ping of a flight attendant's call light. She leaned back, eyes fluttering closed despite the dim overhead lights, and let herself drift into a restless sleep. Her thoughts hovered vaguely over the week's chaos: contracts signed, missed lunches, and the faint ache of regret for a canceled reunion with her brother. The hum of the engines, the soft vibrations through the cabin floor, and the muffled conversations were almost hypnotic. For a brief, blissful moment, the world shrank to the small cocoon of 7C. It was, in every way, a routine flight. Nothing about this journey had screamed danger. She had flown this route countless times, and each time it had been the same. Takeoff, a few hours of turbulence and polite conversation, and then a smooth landing in Los Angeles. She imagined the familiar sequence of events, her mind tracing the steps like a rehearsal, until her eyelids fell heavier and heavier. Halfway into her dozing state, a faint vibration above the hum of the engines drew her attention. She stirred, blinking against the dim light. A sharp voice echoed through the cabin's intercom system, breaking the monotony of the usual flight announcements. "Can one of you fly this plane?" The words floated in the air, almost impossible, and then repeated more urgently. "Can someone, anyone, fly this plane?" Samantha bolted upright, her chest tightening. For a moment she thought it was a joke, perhaps some kind of in-flight prank, but the tone of the voice, strained, shaky, panic, told her otherwise. The cabin went eerily silent, every single passenger freezing mid-action. A mother pressed her child to her chest, whispering frantically. A businessman froze with a pen suspended over a notebook, eyes wide in disbelief. Even the flight attendants, trained to mask fear, were frozen in place, their calm facade cracking. She sat up straighter, trying to see the cockpit door at the front of the plane. It was slightly ajar, revealing the back of a man's head slumped forward. The sight was enough to make her stomach lurch. Her mind, half still clouded by sleep, immediately rejected the possibility. It had to be a medical emergency, she thought. Surely. Her thoughts flew back to her childhood, to the countless hours she had spent playing with flight simulators on her computer. It had been a hobby, a dream of flying without the burden of real responsibility. She had memorized the instruments, the landing procedures, the protocols for emergencies, even if she had never been in a real cockpit. The memories bubbled up, vivid and immediate. The intercom crackled again, the pilot's voice trembling with urgency. "I'm incapacitated, co-pilot's unconscious. Is anyone on board qualified?" Now there was no mistaking it. This was real. Samantha's pulse jumped, her throat dry. Around her, passengers were murmuring, their voices a mixture of fear, disbelief, and frantic speculation. Some were already reaching for their phones, frantically dialing numbers or recording the chaos. A young boy's sob cut through the air, adding to the tension. Samantha's mind raced. She had always believed she was cautious, measured, the kind of person who prepared for emergencies, but this was something else entirely. She had no professional training, not really. She was an analyst, a thinker, not a pilot. And yet something deep inside stirred, a flicker of courage or perhaps sheer instinct. The flight attendants, realizing that no one else seemed capable of helping, gently nudged her toward the cockpit. "Miss, can you help, please?" one of them pleaded. Their faces were etched with fear and hope all at once. Samantha's body went rigid. She wanted to protest, to scream that she couldn't do it. But her feet moved anyway, almost against her will, her steps echoing through the aisle. The hum of the engines, the dim lighting, the anxious eyes of everyone around her, it all condensed into a singular focus. Move forward, act. As she reached the cockpit, the pilot turned to face her, his face pale and lined with sweat. His eyes, wide and desperate, locked onto hers. You fly?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Samantha's own voice trembled as she nodded. I've trained a bit. In simulators." The pilot's hands trembled on the controls. He swallowed, his throat working as if he were trying to form words he couldn't articulate. We don't have time. You have to keep her steady. Keep the plane steady." The cockpit instruments blinked erratically, warning lights flashing red. A sudden jolt ran through the aircraft, and Samantha felt a sickening shift in her stomach. She swallowed hard, her hands hovering over the controls, remembering every tutorial, every lesson, every small piece of knowledge she had absorbed over the years. Behind her, the murmurs of the passengers grew louder. She could feel their fear, their hope, their expectation, pressing down on her like the weight of the entire plane. Flight attendants hovered nearby, some whispering guidance, others frozen in shock. The smell of recycled air and nervous sweat filled the cramped cockpit. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the clouds in molten orange and crimson streaks. It should have been beautiful, serene. But now it felt ominous, like the sky itself was warning her. The gentle hum of the engines had become a tense, vibrating undertone, a reminder that the plane was alive, waiting for someone to take control. Samantha's mind oscillated between panic and determination. The plane jolted again. Passengers screamed, gripping armrests, clutching each other, holding onto fleeting hope. She remembered her father's words from years ago, a mantra she had long forgotten. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting anyway. Her hands finally closed over the yoke. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her, yet beneath the terror a strange clarity emerged. She could do this. Somehow. She had to. And just as she steadied herself, taking a deep breath, the cockpit door rattled. A shadow moved outside the small window of the door. Something or someone was approaching. The cabin held its collective breath, passengers frozen mid-action, waiting for the next move. And in that heartbeat of silence, Samantha realized the flight had changed forever. The sudden intercom announcement had thrown the cabin into a stunned silence, but now chaos began to ripple outward like shockwaves across water. Samantha Owens, still fumbling for composure in the cockpit doorway, felt every heartbeat echoing in her chest. The murmurs of disbelief morphed into frantic whispers, then sharp cries as passengers grasped the terrifying reality. The pilots were incapacitated, and now a stranger, herself, might have to save all their lives. A mother clutched her toddler, tears streaking her face as the child whimpered, sensing the tension. The boy's tiny hands trembled against the fabric of his mother's shirt, and she whispered reassurances she didn't believe herself. Across the aisle, a young couple held hands so tightly their knuckles whitened. Phones were pulled from pockets with trembling fingers, cameras pointed toward the cockpit, capturing every second of what they presumed would become history. Samantha tried to calm herself, inhaling and exhaling, but the air felt thick, almost viscous. Panic pressed against her ribs. Her thoughts darted in every direction. She was not a pilot, not really. She had studied flight simulators, yes, but never a Boeing 737, never at 35,000 feet with hundreds of lives depending on her. And yet, the pilot's trembling voice haunted her. Is anyone on board qualified? Some passengers tried to act. A businessman in a crisp navy suit raised his hand, then quickly lowered it, realizing he had only flown once on a simulator as a joke for a corporate retreat. An elderly man, stooped and gray, spoke quietly to no one in particular. "I can maybe help." His voice cracked. Samantha heard flight attendants responding urgently, explaining that they needed someone with real experience, someone who could read instruments and adjust the controls. No one volunteered further. The silence that followed was deafening. Somewhere near the back, a teenager in ripped jeans, earbuds still in, froze mid-scroll on his phone. He looked up wide-eyed, realizing the gravity of what was happening. Even from row 28, passengers could sense the urgency seeping through the cabin walls. The air buzzed, charged with fear, disbelief, and the brittle thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone could take the reins. Samantha's hand trembled as she adjusted her grip on the cockpit yoke. Her mind raced through everything she had ever learned about flight procedures. She recalled the layout of instruments, the sequence of flaps, the throttle adjustments, and the emergency checklists. But now it was all painfully real. She could not press retry. There would be no simulation, no reset button. "Ma'am, please," one of the flight attendants urged softly, her face pale and damp with sweat. "You have to go. We need you to help him." Samantha swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat. She tried to visualize herself in the pilot's seat, running through the motions. She remembered the countless nights spent hunched over a computer, practicing takeoffs, landings, and emergency scenarios. That knowledge was dormant until now, a flicker suddenly ignited by necessity, by pure survival instinct. She nodded slightly, her voice quivering. I'll try." The cockpit door opened wider and the pilot's eyes flicked toward her. His face was ashen, the sweat streaking his pale complexion. He gestured weakly to the controls, muttering, "Steady, just keep her steady." Samantha stepped into the cockpit, knees trembling. The pilot swiveled slightly, his forehead creased with lines of worry and pain. The co-pilot slumped forward, nearly unconscious. Instruments blinked with a cacophony of red warning lights, the engines thrumming irregularly. The cabin behind them erupted with gasps, cries, and the rustle of seat belts as passengers braced themselves, pressing their faces into the seatbacks. Samantha's fingers hovered over the controls, memorized sequences colliding with raw fear. She could hear the shouts of panic from the cabin, the quiet sobs, the whispered prayers. The plane shuddered once violently, throwing her forward slightly. Her stomach lurched. Her hands shook as she adjusted the throttle, trying to stabilize the aircraft. Then the intercom crackled again. The pilot's voice, weak but commanding, reached the cabin. "Everyone, please stay calm. We're being helped. Just stay calm." Passengers clutched each other. A man near the wing muttered, "This can't be happening. This is impossible." A young woman pressed her forehead to the window, eyes wide, watching clouds swirl violently outside, lightning splitting the sky like a jagged scar. Rain hammered the fuselage, each droplet echoing like gunfire against the metal skin. Samantha's mind spun. She realized the turbulence was worsening, not just from weather, but from her own inexperience and the delicate balance of a plane suddenly lacking a fully functional cockpit crew. Each adjustment to the controls sent tremors through the cabin. Drinks spilled, snack carts toppled, and the collective fear became almost tangible, pressing against her shoulders. The flight attendants tried to maintain order, their voices calm but urgent. "Passengers, please remain seated, keep your seatbelts fastened, and stay calm. We are handling the situation," one of them repeated over and over, as if chanting could make reality conform to their words. In the cockpit, Samantha focused, blocking out the chaos. Her pulse pounded in her ears, matching the rhythmic vibration of the engines. She ran through the emergency procedures in her mind like a mantra, her eyes flicking between dials, instruments, and warning lights. The red alert indicators demanded action, screamed in bright, unforgiving flashes. Her fingers danced across the controls, each movement tentative yet decisive. The plane jolted violently again. Gasps erupted from the passengers. A woman in 12B clutched her knees, whispering, "God, please." An elderly man muttered prayers under his breath, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. Samantha's own hands were slick with sweat, but she forced herself to breathe, to focus. Then, as she steadied the yoke, she heard a sudden commotion near the front of the cabin. The cockpit door rattled again, this time more forcefully. Shadows moved outside the small glass window. Samantha froze for a heartbeat. Was it a crew member, another passenger trying to help, or something else entirely? The plane shuddered once more. Outside, the storm clouds roared, dark and angry, while flashes of lightning illuminated the panicked faces pressed against the windows. Rain pelted the fuselage. each drop adding a drumbeat to the chaotic symphony of fear inside the cabin. Passengers' whispers grew louder. "Who's flying the plane?" someone asked, voice cracking. How can a passenger?" Another woman sobbed quietly into her husband's shoulder, muttering, "This isn't real, it can't be real." Samantha, heart hammering, tried to steady both the aircraft and herself. Every adjustment of the yoke, every flick of a switch, was a test of instinct, memory, and nerve. She felt the eyes of everyone on the plane, not just the pilot or crew, but hundreds of souls now invested in her ability to survive this impossible situation. And in that suspended moment, as the plane trembled and the storm raged, Samantha understood the truth. This flight would never be routine again. The cockpit alarms blared in unison, a shrill, unforgiving chorus. The engine stuttered, a deep, metallic groan echoing through the fuselage. Samantha's hands tightened on the controls, her mind racing. She had to act, to think, to survive. But even as she focused, a new, unexplained signal appeared on the radar, something moving fast, shadowy, just beyond the storm, just beyond their comprehension. The plane shuddered violently. Screams erupted behind her. Samantha's pulse became a drumbeat of pure adrenaline. And then over the intercom, the pilot's trembling voice whispered, almost impossibly, We weren't alone up here." Samantha's knuckles whitened as she gripped the yoke. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The warning lights in the cockpit blinked like a frantic Morse code, red against the dim glow of the instruments. The pilot slumped slightly in his seat, exhausted and trembling, but he managed a hoarse instruction. "Alt, hold, maintain altitude, check flaps." His voice cracked, each word carrying the weight of life or death. Samantha's fingers hovered over the controls, trembling. She had seen these buttons, toggled these switches countless times in simulations, but now every movement was irreversible. The hum of the engines felt louder, almost sentient, vibrating through her bones. Around her, the cockpit seemed impossibly small, the warning lights glowing like angry eyes in the darkness. "Just stay calm," she whispered to herself, though her voice was brittle. The plane lurched, a violent, stomach-churning jolt that threw her slightly forward. She adjusted the yoke, remembering her simulated landings, her takeoffs, her emergency drills. But this was no simulation. This was real. Hundreds of lives depended on her next move. The cockpit door rattled again, more insistently this time. Samantha froze, realizing she wasn't alone in the small space of the cabin. Flight attendants had entered, their faces pale but resolute, trying to assist without obstructing. Behind them, passengers craned their necks, whispering frantically. Every eye in the cabin seemed to burn into her back, demanding silently, "Do not fail." Suddenly the plane shuddered violently, the turbulence intensifying. Samantha's stomach lurched. Outside, sheets of rain streaked the windshield, lightning flashing intermittently, illuminating the storm in stark, terrifying detail. Clouds churned like dark, boiling water. She fought to steady the aircraft, adjusting throttles, tilting flaps, praying to keep a steady hand despite the chaos. "Steady, steady," she muttered, running a shaky hand over the instruments. The pilot's eyes flicked to her, a silent mixture of hope and fear. He gestured weakly as if to guide her, but his own strength was nearly gone. Samantha realized with a sudden, icy clarity that she was the only one capable now. There was no safety net, no co-pilot. The responsibility pressed down on her chest like a physical weight. In the cabin, panic had reached a fever pitch. A man near the rear shouted, "Somebody has to do something." A woman in 14B clutched her knees, rocking back and forth, whispering prayers to God she had never truly believed in. Flight attendants attempted to soothe passengers, guiding them to remain seated, fasten seatbelts, and brace themselves for impact if necessary. But the trembling hands, wide eyes, and tense jaws betrayed their fear. Samantha's mind raced. She had trained for emergencies, yes, but nothing prepared her for this. Nothing prepared her for the reality of hundreds of terrified passengers, the deafening storm outside, and the weight of a plane that now seemed to lurch at her every command. Her palms were slick with sweat, her heart hammered, yet amidst the fear a strange clarity emerged. She knew the basics. She could do this. She had to. The pilot's voice cracked over the intercom again. Altitude decreasing, need correction. His hands trembled as he pointed to the altimeter. Samantha adjusted the throttle, her fingers pressing switches she had only seen in simulations. The plane groaned, responded, and then stabilized, just barely. The first flicker of control ignited a spark of determination. But the relief was short-lived. Another sudden shudder rocked the fuselage. The storm outside was more violent than anything she had ever encountered, a wall of wind and rain battering the plane. Lightning flashed close, illuminating terrified faces pressed against the windows. The pilot winced, his lips moving silently as he mouthed a prayer. Samantha focused on the instruments, blocking out the cabin's screams. She reminded herself of every emergency procedure she had memorized: altitude adjustments, flaps, rudder corrections. Her hands moved almost automatically, muscle memory colliding with adrenaline. The plane leveled, then lurched again, testing the limits of both her nerve and her nascent skill. "Hold her steady," the pilot rasped, voice almost a whisper now. His sweat-drenched hands trembled, but he gestured toward the yoke as if willing her strength into it. Samantha swallowed, forcing her fear down, centering herself. She realized in that moment that she was not just flying a plane, she was commanding a life suspended in metal and air, a fragile cocoon of humanity hurtling through a storm. Suddenly an alarm shrieked, a blaring red warning she had never seen in her simulations. Samantha froze for a split second, panic threatening to overtake her. The plane's engine stuttered, groaned, and the controls felt suddenly heavy, unresponsive in her grip. Sweat ran down her forehead. She took a deep, trembling breath and followed the emergency checklist she had memorized from years of practice. Toggle here, adjust throttle, flaps slightly forward, rudder correction. She moved decisively. Hopping, her memory matched the reality of physics, gravity, and mechanical precision. The cockpit door rattled violently again. Someone was trying to enter, or perhaps get a better look at her. She couldn't risk distraction. Her eyes remained glued to the instruments. Outside, the storm intensified, clouds twisting in impossible shapes, winds howling like beasts trapped in the sky. The rain streaked the windshield, and lightning illuminated the terrified faces of passengers behind her in fleeting, ghostly flashes. Suddenly, a passenger emerged from the aisle, a young man with the pale green hoodie of a college student, his hands shaking, eyes wide. I've done simulators," he said, voice quivering. Samantha's mind raced. He could help: 2 hands, 2 brains, 1 mission, survival. She nodded slightly, her voice barely audible. "Fine, sit here. Help me with the throttle and flaps." Together they worked in tense coordination. Each adjustment of the controls became a dance of trust and desperation. The plane responded, but only partially. Red warning lights still blared. Turbulence continued to shake the fuselage. Every passenger screamed or sobbed behind them, yet somehow they maintained a fragile balance, suspended between chaos and hope. Then, as the storm raged outside, a new blip appeared on the radar screen. Samantha squinted, focusing through the haze of rain, adrenaline, and fear. A shadow moving fast, irregularly. Something or someone was out there, tracking them through the storm. The pilot, still slumped and weak, noticed it too, his eyes widening. We're not alone," he whispered, voice barely audible over the storm and alarms. Samantha froze. The plane trembled again, the shadow on the radar moving closer, faster. Questions exploded in her mind. Was it another aircraft? Military intervention? Something more sinister? There was no time to wonder. Survival depended on immediate action. The cabin was tense, every passenger aware of the gravity, though most could not see what she faced. Sobs, prayers, and whispered reassurances echoed around her. The storm's roar was deafening, the lights on the instruments flashing, the controls jerking in her hands. She realized that nothing would be routine again. Not for her, not for anyone on this flight. And in that suspended heartbeat, as the shadow on the radar moved closer, the plane trembled violently, the storm outside raging like a living, vengeful entity. Samantha knew one thing with absolute clarity. She had no choice but to fly, not perfectly, not heroically, but just enough to survive. The weight of hundreds of lives pressed down on her shoulders. And in that moment, as fear, adrenaline, and determination collided, Samantha realized she was no longer asleep in 7C, she was the pilot. The storm outside battered the Boeing 737 with unrelenting force. Rain streaked the windshield in sheets, each droplet a hammer against the fragile fuselage. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the terrified faces of passengers pressed against their windows, ghostly in the strobe of the storm. The engines groaned under the strain, the cockpit instruments flashing a chaotic symphony of warnings. Samantha Owens sat rigid in the pilot's seat, hands trembling over the yoke. The passenger who had joined her, call him Josh, a college student with a shaky confidence in flight simulators, pointed nervously to a blinking console. "Throttle, I think it's—" He stopped mid-sentence as the plane jolted violently, forcing them both to steady themselves. Her mind raced. Every training session, every simulation she had ever completed came flooding back, but the stakes were nothing like this. Hundreds of lives hung in the balance, and any misstep could cost them all. The pilot slumped in his chair, pale and sweating, his forehead streaked with lines of worry. He could guide her no longer. She was alone, or nearly so. Samantha closed her eyes for a brief, trembling second and breathed deeply. She remembered her father's words from childhood. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting anyway." Those words now felt like a lifeline. Her hands steadied just enough on the controls. She had to act. "Josh," she said, her voice firm despite the quiver underneath, "help me with the flaps. We need to stabilize her before we even think about descent." Josh nodded, swallowing hard. His hands shook as he toggled switches and adjusted controls under Samantha's direction. Together, they worked in tense synchronization, checking the warning lights, reading the altimeter, and adjusting the engine's power. Slowly, incrementally, the plane began to level. The violent pitching eased just enough that passengers could catch their breath. But the storm wasn't relenting. Wind gusts slammed against the fuselage, rattling the windows and shaking the cabin violently. The plane shuddered, throwing drinks, snacks, and a frightened handful of passengers into chaos. Samantha gritted her teeth, forcing herself to focus. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. A flight attendant pressed against the cockpit door, her eyes wide with fear. "Ma'am, please keep her steady. Everyone is counting on you." Samantha nodded, barely registering the words. She couldn't think about passengers yet. She had to survive the storm first. Then the pilot, his face pale and lined with exhaustion, muttered a warning. "Altitude dropping too fast." His words sliced through the cockpit like a knife. Samantha's stomach dropped. She looked at the altimeter. Sure enough, the plane was losing height faster than she could compensate. Her mind spun. This was the moment she had been dreading. She had to decide. Risk a drastic maneuver to gain altitude or continue cautiously and hope the storm didn't break them first. The seconds stretched into eternity. The plane shuddered violently again, throwing them both against the seats. "Do it," Josh whispered, his voice barely audible. We don't have a choice." Samantha swallowed hard. She adjusted the throttle, her fingers trembling as she pushed the engines toward maximum power. The plane groaned in protest, a metal creature straining under pressure. Outside, the storm seemed to roar louder, as if mocking her attempt. Lightning flashed, and for a terrifying instant, Samantha thought she saw another aircraft, or something else, moving close by on the radar. The cockpit's warning alarms blared louder, red lights pulsing violently. Samantha's vision narrowed, her hands moving instinctively, recalling every emergency procedure she had ever memorized. She toggled switches, adjusted flaps, corrected the rudder, and fought to steady the aircraft against the violent gusts. Minutes, or was it hours, passed in a blur of adrenaline, noise, and chaos. Samantha could hear the screams of passengers behind her, feel the tremors of fear in the cabin. She forced herself to focus on the instruments, the yoke, the rhythm of the engines. Every adjustment counted. Every fraction of a second mattered. Then the unexpected happened. The shadow on the radar, a fast-moving, unidentified object, shifted closer. Samantha froze. She couldn't afford distraction, yet her mind couldn't ignore it. What was it? Another plane, a military aircraft, something more dangerous. The thought twisted her stomach, but she had no time to dwell on it. Survival demanded action. The plane jolted again, violently, throwing Josh against the side panel. He regained his footing, trembling, eyes wide. "We were gaining a little stability," he said, his voice shaky. "But the storm, it's not letting up." Samantha nodded, forcing herself to keep calm. She adjusted the plane's pitch, carefully managing ascent and descent, trying to maintain a level trajectory. She had to buy time for the storm to weaken, for the shadow on the radar to pass, for them to survive long enough to attempt a landing. The pilot leaned back, sweat streaking his face, his eyes glimmering with something like relief. You're doing it," he whispered, voice hoarse. I didn't think anyone could," he trailed off, exhausted. Samantha said nothing. Words were a luxury, focus was survival. Suddenly, a violent gust struck the plane, tilting it sharply to the right. Warning lights flashed frantically. Passengers screamed, some hitting the ceiling or clutching armrests. Samantha's stomach lurched, her knuckles white as she fought to bring the plane back to level. She called out adjustments to Josh, her voice steadying despite the storm. "Flaps 10 degrees, throttle slightly forward, steady." Josh complied, and slowly, agonizingly, the plane began to right itself. Sweat streamed down Samantha's face, mixing with tears she didn't have time to wipe away. The cabin behind them remained tense, the air thick with fear and anticipation. Each second felt like an eternity. Then came the realization. They were out of time. The plane's altitude was dropping dangerously, the engines groaning, the storm raging with unrelenting fury. If they didn't act decisively now, survival was no longer guaranteed. Samantha's mind raced through options, calculations flashing like lightning. They could attempt an emergency descent, aim for the nearest airport, or try to ride out the storm at their current altitude. Her gaze fell on the radar again. The shadow had moved closer, an unknown, fast-moving presence in the storm. Fear gnawed at the edges of her mind, but she blocked it out. Decision had to come first. Survival was now a matter of choice, action, and nerve. With a deep breath, Samantha made her decision. She would gain altitude, push the engines to their limits, and hope they could outpace the turbulence long enough to stabilize the plane. Every muscle in her body tensed as she executed the maneuver. The plane groaned, pitching violently, but slowly began to climb. The pilot, watching her, allowed himself a faint smile. You're the real deal," he said, voice weak but filled with awe. "Keep her steady, just keep her steady." Samantha nodded, eyes fixed on the instruments, heart hammering, adrenaline surging. The cabin remained tense, passengers gripping seats, whispering prayers, holding their breaths. The storm continued to rage, the unknown object on the radar closing in, and the plane's fate hanging by a slender thread. And in that suspended moment, as the engines roared and the rain battered the fuselage, Samantha realized the truth. She was no longer merely a passenger in 7C, she had become the pilot, the guardian of hundreds of lives, and the storm was far from over. The storm raged like a living creature, lashing the Boeing 737 with relentless fury. Rain hammered the fuselage, wind shrieked against the wings, and lightning fractured the sky in jagged, violent bolts. Each flash illuminated the terrified faces pressed against windows, ghostly and wide-eyed, while the plane trembled under the assault. Samantha Owens gritted her teeth, knuckles white on the yoke. The passenger beside her, Josh, clutched the throttle with trembling hands, eyes darting between instruments and the storm outside. We're holding," he muttered, voice quivering. "But it's getting worse." "Keep her level," Samantha instructed, her voice calm despite the storm and her own fear. "Adjust the flaps slightly, throttle forward steady. Every word was a lifeline, every movement of her hands a battle against physics, adrenaline, and instinct. The pilot slumped in his seat, sweat streaking his face, pale and trembling. He could no longer take command but remained a lifeline of guidance, whispering instructions that Samantha followed with desperate precision. Altitude, check. Flaps, 10 degrees steady. His voice was barely audible over the roaring engines and storm. Passengers screamed in terror. A mother pressed her child to her chest, whispering prayers she didn't believe. A businessman in row 14 gritted his teeth, hands clenched over the armrests, muttering to himself. Flight attendants struggled to maintain order, herding people into seats and urging seatbelts to be fastened, their faces etched with fear. The plane lurched violently, throwing objects across the cabin. A tray table toppled, spilling half-full cups of coffee. A bag slid down the aisle, slamming against seat legs. The sound of metal and glass colliding reverberated through the fuselage like gunfire. Samantha's stomach churned, but she forced herself to focus. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. Her eyes darted to the radar again. The shadow, an unknown, fast-moving presence, loomed closer, tracking them through the storm. Samantha's mind raced. What was it? Another aircraft, military intervention, something more sinister. She didn't have time to wonder. Survival demanded action. The plane pitched sharply to the right as a gust of wind slammed the wing. Warning alarms blared in the cockpit, shrill and urgent. Samantha's heart pounded as she fought to stabilize the aircraft. Every adjustment of the yoke, every flick of a switch, had immediate consequences. The plane groaned under the strain, metal protesting the turbulence and her inexperience. Josh, pale and sweating, followed her instructions as best he could. Together, they managed to bring the plane back to level, but the relief was fleeting. The storm was relentless, each gust more violent than the last. Rain streaked the windshield, wind rattled the fuselage, and lightning illuminated the interior of the cockpit in stark, terrifying flashes. The pilot leaned back, exhausted and pale. You're keeping her steady," he whispered, voice cracking. "But the engines, they're straining. We might not make it." His words hung in the air, a haunting reminder of the fragility of their situation. Samantha swallowed hard. She couldn't afford to think of failure. She had to focus, to act decisively. She adjusted the throttle, recalibrated the flaps, and monitored the instruments with painstaking attention. The plane responded, but only partially. Each second was a struggle, a delicate balance between survival and catastrophe. In the cabin, panic had reached its peak. Passengers screamed, sobbed, and clutched each other. Flight attendants moved through the chaos, urging calm, guiding people to brace positions. The sound of terror was deafening, yet Samantha blocked it out, centering herself on the controls. Then came a new jolt. The plane pitched sharply downward, a gut-wrenching drop that sent her stomach into her throat. Alarms blared violently. Warning lights flashed like red fire across the cockpit. The engines groaned under strain, and the fuselage shuddered as if the plane itself were alive, resisting her commands. Samantha's hands flew across the controls. She adjusted the throttle, pulled back on the yoke, and recalibrated the flaps. The plane responded, climbing again, but not enough. The storm pressed against them, unrelenting, as if testing their will to survive. Josh's voice broke through her concentration. There's something on the radar, it's moving fast toward us." Samantha glanced at the screen, her stomach twisting. The shadow was closer now, its shape indistinct but menacing, tracking them with unsettling precision. The pilot, too weak to speak loudly, pointed at the radar. It's not natural, stay focused." His words sent a chill through Samantha. Something was out there, watching, perhaps waiting. She had no time to process what it was. The storm, the plane, the passengers, everything demanded her full attention. The plane lurched again violently as a gust of wind caught the left wing. Alarms shrieked. Samantha's heart hammered. She barked instructions to Josh, her voice sharp, unwavering. Throttle forward, flaps 5 degrees, rudder slight right, hold her level. Together they managed to stabilize the plane again, the engines groaning in protest. The shadow on the radar moved closer still, an ominous presence lurking in the storm. Samantha forced herself to ignore it, focusing on the immediate battle, survival against wind, rain, and turbulence. Time became a blur. The storm roared, engines strained, passengers screamed. Samantha's hands ached, sweat streamed down her face, and her mind teetered on the edge of exhaustion. Yet she could not stop. Every second mattered. Every movement could mean the difference between life and death. Then a sudden bolt of lightning struck nearby, illuminating the cockpit. For an instant, Samantha saw the fear etched on Josh's face, the pale, strained features of the pilot, the red warnings blinking across the console. The plane groaned, pitching violently again. Her stomach lurched. She knew they were reaching the limits of what the aircraft could endure. Another gust, another shudder, and disaster could strike. The shadow on the radar was no longer a distant threat. It was close enough to demand attention, a looming presence in the storm. Samantha's hands tightened on the controls. She could not fail. She would not fail. Hundreds of lives depended on her. The storm raged, the plane shuddered, the radar glowed ominously. She inhaled, centered herself, and prepared for the next impossible maneuver. And then over the intercom, the pilot's voice, trembling but steady enough to reach the cabin, whispered, "Brace, we might have to descend fast." Passengers screamed and braced. Flight attendants clutched them, whispering frantic instructions. The plane lurched downward, and Samantha's stomach dropped with it. She realized in that moment of sheer terror that the flight was far from over. The storm, the shadow, the chaos, it was only just beginning. And she, the passenger-turned-pilot, was the only one who could guide them through it. Samantha's hands were numb from the constant pressure on the yoke. Every muscle in her body screamed from strain. Sweat poured down her face, her shirt sticking to her back. The cockpit lights flickered and the instruments seemed alive, screaming their warnings in bright, red flashes. The Boeing 737 groaned under the assault of the storm, pitching violently with each gust of wind. Josh, sitting beside her, was pale and trembling. His fingers flew over the throttle, the flaps, and the rudder under Samantha's guidance. "I think we can stabilize her if we keep her steady," he whispered, voice shaking. "But the engines," his words died in the roar of the wind and the alarms blaring from the cockpit. Samantha barely registered the cabin chaos behind her. Screams, cries, and the rattle of objects flying across the fuselage formed a horrifying symphony of fear. She focused solely on the yoke, on the instruments, on the fragile thread keeping the plane airborne. One mistake, one miscalculation, and it would all be over. The pilot slumped lower into his seat, exhausted beyond measure. "We don't have much time," he rasped, voice weak. His eyes flickered to the radar. It's closing in, whatever it is, keep her steady." Samantha's pulse quickened. The shadow on the radar, a fast-moving, unknown presence, was closer now. The storm might have been their initial adversary, but this was something else entirely. Something deliberate, tracking them through the violent storm. A chill ran down her spine. "We need to gain altitude," she muttered to Josh, trying to keep her voice steady. "Throttle full, flaps adjusted, hold her steady." Her hands moved instinctively, recalling every emergency drill, every simulator session she had ever endured. The plane responded, but sluggishly, groaning under the strain of the engines and turbulence. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cockpit. Samantha saw the terror on Josh's face, the sweat on the pilot's brow, the blinking alarms demanding perfection. The plane pitched violently again, tossing her forward. Her stomach lurched. She gritted her teeth and pulled back on the yoke, trying to level the plane. The storm was relentless. Rain hammered the fuselage, wind screamed through the wings, and thunder shook the cabin like distant artillery. The engines groaned, warning lights blazed. Samantha's hands ached, but she couldn't let go. She couldn't falter. Then came the unexpected, A sudden, sharp movement on the radar. The shadow changed trajectory, moving directly toward them, unnervingly precise, almost intelligent. Samantha's throat went dry. It's coming closer," she whispered to Josh. His eyes widened. "We're not alone up here," the pilot rasped, voice barely audible over the storm. "Whatever it is, it's tracking us." Samantha swallowed hard. She had no idea what it was. Another plane, military, something unknown. There was no time to analyze. Survival demanded action. She tightened her grip on the yoke, pushing the plane through violent turbulence, adjusting throttle and flaps in a delicate life-or-death balance. The cabin erupted again. Passengers screamed as the plane pitched sharply downward. Drinks spilled, seat belts tightened across terrified bodies. Flight attendants clutched passengers, shouting instructions, moving through chaos with remarkable composure despite the fear etched across their faces. Samantha could hear the fear, the prayers, the sobs. Every heartbeat behind her reflected her own adrenaline-fueled panic. "Steady, hold her level," she shouted to Josh, who mirrored her movements on the auxiliary controls. Together, they managed to bring the plane back into a tenuous balance. The engines groaned, but the plane stabilized slightly. Samantha allowed herself a fraction of a breath, but there was no relief. The shadow on the radar loomed closer. The pilot stirred slightly, pointing weakly toward a console. "Check fuel, reserves, and descent options." His voice trailed off, every word heavy with exhaustion. Samantha glanced at the fuel gauge, lower than she had expected. Every maneuver, every adjustment consumed precious reserves. The thought of running out of fuel sent a cold wave of fear through her. The storm intensified as if mocking their struggle. Wind slammed the plane from all sides and the fuselage shuddered violently. Samantha's stomach dropped again as the plane pitched unpredictably. She barked instructions at Josh, her voice the anchor in the chaos. "Rudder slight left, throttle steady, flaps 5 degrees, keep her level." Seconds stretched into eternity. Each flash of lightning revealed the fear and hope etched on the passengers' faces. The plane responded, but the storm was unyielding. The engines screamed, the fuselage groaned, and the unknown shadow continued its approach, a constant reminder that danger was no longer confined to weather alone. Suddenly, a violent gust struck the plane's left wing. Warning alarms blared. Samantha's hands tightened on the yoke. "Hold her! Don't let her tilt!" she shouted. Josh obeyed, hands flying across controls, but the plane shuddered again violently. The cabin shook, passengers screamed. Objects tumbled down the aisle. Samantha felt the plane's weight shift under her, the tension of hundreds of lives pressing down on her shoulders. Her mind raced, calculating adjustments, predicting reactions, fighting fear with every ounce of willpower. The radar shadow moved again. It was closer now, impossibly fast, almost intelligent. Samantha forced herself to block the fear, focusing solely on flying. There was no room for doubt, no margin for error. The plane groaned as she made minute adjustments, throttling engines, adjusting flaps, leveling the wings. Minutes, though it felt like hours, passed in a blur of alarms, storm, and adrenaline. Samantha's arms ached. Sweat poured down her face, but she could not stop. Every second mattered. Every movement could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Then came a moment of fragile hope. The plane stabilized slightly. The engines hummed more evenly. The shadow on the radar seemed to hover, circling them rather than closing in directly. Samantha allowed herself a small, shallow breath, though her hands never left the yoke. The pilot stirred more fully, eyes still wide with fear but glimmering with pride. "You're keeping her steady more than I thought." His voice was hoarse, but it carried a faint encouragement. Samantha nodded, forcing herself to remain calm. The storm was not yet over, but she had bought precious time. Suddenly, over the intercom, passengers' screams rose again. The plane pitched violently, sending objects and people flying. Samantha's stomach dropped. She barked commands to Josh. "Throttle forward, flaps 10 degrees, rudder slight right." The plane responded, groaning and shaking but holding steady. Sweat streamed down Samantha's face, mixing with tears she didn't have time to wipe away. She realized the storm was relentless. The shadow was still out there, and the plane was only as strong as her hands and nerve. And in that suspended moment, as lightning lit the storm outside and alarms blared in the cockpit, Samantha realized the truth. She was no longer a passenger. She was the lifeline, the guardian, the pilot. And whatever was tracking them, whatever unknown force hovered on the radar, was closing in, and she would have to face it while keeping everyone alive. The storm had no mercy. Rain battered the Boeing 737, wind screamed against the wings, and the plane groaned under the relentless force. Samantha Owen's hands were raw from gripping the yoke, muscles trembling with exhaustion. Every alarm in the cockpit screamed, and the flashing red lights reflected in her sweat-streaked face. Josh sat beside her, pale and shaking, mirroring every adjustment she made. We can hold her," he said in a voice so faint it barely rose above the roar of the engines. "But the radar, it's still there, moving fast." Samantha's jaw tightened. The shadow on the radar had been their constant, mysterious threat, tracking them through the storm. She didn't know if it was another plane, a military aircraft, or something else entirely. There was no time to figure it out. There was only action. She adjusted throttle, flaps, and rudder in a precise, frantic dance to keep the plane level, each movement critical, each second a gamble. The pilot, slumped in his seat, weak and sweating, whispered hoarsely, You're ready for the approach. I can guide from here." His eyes flickered to the radar, then the instruments. Altitude descending, wind gusts, watch. Samantha nodded, swallowing down fear. The passengers behind her were silent, holding their breath, each soul relying on her reflexes, intuition, and raw determination. She adjusted the plane slightly, trying to find a balance between survival and control. Every shudder of the fuselage, every violent tilt of the wings, sent a jolt through her stomach. The storm was relentless. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the terrified faces pressed against the windows. Rain streaked the fuselage in sheets. Thunder shook the cabin like an earthquake. The plane pitched sharply, a sudden gust slamming the left wing. Samantha fought to stabilize, her hands shaking violently. "Throttle full, flaps 10 degrees," she shouted to Josh. He responded immediately, mirroring her instructions. The plane groaned, the engines straining, but they managed to hold her steady for a precious few seconds. The pilot spoke again, voice barely audible over the roar. "Runway sight, altitude, adjust, descending." His words were cryptic but guiding. Samantha leaned into them, trying to translate his fractured guidance into action. The radar shadow moved closer, impossibly fast, a menacing presence tracking them through the storm. Samantha ignored it for now, focusing on what she could control. The plane, the instruments, the fragile lives within the fuselage. Each adjustment of throttle and flaps was a negotiation with gravity itself. Then came a violent lurch. The plane pitched downward sharply, sending a wave of fear through the cabin. Objects toppled, passengers screamed, and Samantha's stomach sank. She barked instructions at Josh. "Throttle steady, flaps slight up, rudder slight left." The engines groaned, warning lights flashed frantically, but the plane stabilized, just enough. Sweat streamed down Samantha's face, mingling with tears she didn't dare let fall. She realized the storm was not only a test of skill but of endurance, nerve, and willpower. Minutes stretched into eternity. Every jolt, every tilt, every alarm was a reminder that survival was uncertain. The radar shadow loomed closer, circling them with disturbing precision. Samantha had no answers, only the necessity to act, to keep the plane airborne long enough to attempt a landing. The cabin remained tense, passengers holding tightly to seats and each other. Flight attendants whispered instructions, keeping voices calm while their own fear was palpable. The storm's roar, the screech of engines, and the groan of the plane created a chaotic symphony of terror. Samantha's hands ached, but she could not let go. She adjusted the yoke, throttle, and flaps with painstaking precision. The plane responded, climbing slightly, then leveling out. Her heart hammered. The runway was still distant, the storm unyielding, and the shadow on the radar still close. The pilot, noticing her focus and composure, gave a faint, approving nod. "Steady, you're doing it. Approach, prepare, flare." His voice trailed off as he monitored instruments, eyes flicking to warnings. Samantha's mind was a torrent of calculations. Descent rate, wind direction, turbulence, engine capacity, passenger safety. Each second was crucial. The plane pitched violently again, a sharp gust catching the wing. She barked instructions to Josh: "Throttle forward, flaps 5 degrees, rudder slight right." The plane groaned, pitching and swaying under the storm's relentless assault. Lightning flashed, illuminating passengers' terrified faces. Samantha realized they were close, but not close enough. She needed to find the runway, align perfectly, and land safely, or all her efforts would be in vain. Then she saw it, faint through the storm, lights glimmering on the horizon. The runway, her pulse spiked. She barked to Josh: "There, visual, keep her steady, descend gradually." The plane responded slowly, groaning under the strain. The shadow on the radar hovered nearby, its presence ominous, a reminder that danger was far from over. Samantha ignored it, focusing on the immediate task: landing. The cockpit shuddered again. The storm was relentless, gusts slamming the plane unpredictably. Samantha's stomach lurched with every violent tilt. She barked instructions to Josh: "Flaps 10 degrees, throttle steady, rudder slight left." The plane leveled just enough. The runway lights grew brighter, clearer, cutting through the storm like a beacon. Sweat poured down Samantha's face, her muscles trembling. She adjusted the throttle, holding the plane steady, her eyes flicking between instruments and the distant runway. Passengers behind her braced, eyes wide, clutching armrests and each other. The storm's roar was deafening, engines screaming, but a fragile hope hung in the air. Samantha's heart pounded, but she remained focused. One last maneuver, one last adjustment. "Prepare for flare," the pilot whispered, voice barely audible. Samantha nodded, guiding the plane carefully, inch by inch, toward the runway. Each second stretched, the plane swaying under the storm's assault, the shadows still present on radar, a silent threat. Then, with a violent gust threatening to knock them off course, Samantha pulled back slightly on the yoke, initiating the flare. The plane's nose rose, wheels approaching the runway. She felt the shudder of metal against wind, the groan of engines, the tremor of the fuselage. Passengers gasped, flight attendants whispered urgent reassurances. Josh mirrored her movements, hands shaking, aiding with throttle adjustments. The plane's wheels touched the runway, bouncing slightly before settling. Samantha guided her carefully, countering gusts, adjusting throttle, keeping the plane aligned. And finally, with a groan and a screech of tires, the Boeing 737 rolled to a stop. The storm still raged around them, but they had made it. The runway lights shone steadily, a lifeline in the chaos. Samantha slumped back, trembling, her hands raw and sweat-soaked. Josh exhaled shakily beside her. The pilot, weak but alive, allowed himself a faint, grateful smile. You did it. We made it." But outside, the storm was not yet done, and the shadow on the radar remained, lurking, leaving a final, chilling question in the air. What had been tracking them all along? The tires screeched against the wet runway as the Boeing 737 finally came to a halt. Samantha Owen's arms trembled, fingers clutching the yoke as if letting go might unravel the miracle she had just engineered. The storm still roared around them, sheets of rain hammering the fuselage, but the plane, groaning, battered, and alive, remained firmly on the tarmac. Josh exhaled shakily beside her, eyes wide and pale. We actually made it," he whispered, voice cracking. The pilot, still slumped and sweating, let out a ragged breath, his hands shaking as he clutched the dashboard. "By God, you did it," he murmured. You saved everyone." For a long moment, no one spoke. The storm's fury outside contrasted sharply with the tense, electric silence in the cockpit. Sweat and rain streaked Samantha's face, mixing with tears she hadn't realized were forming. Her heart pounded, adrenaline still coursing through her veins, but the terror that had gripped her for hours began to fade into relief, tentative, fragile, yet powerful. The intercom crackled to life, flight attendants, voices shaky but resolute. Passengers, please remain seated. The plane has landed safely. Emergency crews are on the way. Gasps, sobs, and whispered prayers echoed through the cabin. Hands gripped armrests, tears streaked faces, and passengers began to realize the full magnitude of what had just happened. From the cockpit, Samantha looked at the radar one last time. The shadow, the unknown, fast-moving presence that had haunted them throughout the storm, was still there, stationary now, hovering just outside the range. The pilots and crew had speculated, feared, and imagined countless possibilities. Another plane, military interception, perhaps even an unidentified aircraft. But as Samantha's eyes focused, she realized the truth. It wasn't a threat. Not exactly. It had been a storm-chasing research aircraft, sent to track unusual weather patterns and turbulence. Its radar signature had coincidentally aligned with theirs, moving so precisely that it seemed almost intelligent, almost hostile. Relief washed through Samantha in a tide of disbelief and exhaustion. They weren't being hunted. They had merely been in the wrong place at the wrong time, their lives intersecting with forces beyond ordinary understanding. Still, the adrenaline lingered. Her hands shook as she guided the plane to a slow taxi toward the designated emergency gate. Ground crews, clad in reflective raincoats, waved frantically, directing the aircraft to a stop. The engines roared as the plane slowed, finally settling completely on the wet tarmac. The cabin erupted in cautious applause, nervous laughter, and sobs of relief. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking passengers, helping the elderly, comforting children. A woman from row 14B pressed her hands together, whispering a prayer of gratitude. A man in the back seat collapsed into his wife's arms, whispering, "I thought we were done for." Samantha's eyes wandered over the cabin, taking in every face. Hundreds of souls, all alive because she had acted. Hundreds of lives saved by the instinct, memory, and courage that had lain dormant in her until the moment the pilot had called out, "Can anyone fly this plane?" The pilot, now slightly more composed, turned to her, his face a mixture of awe and relief. "I've been flying for over 20 years, he said, voice rough. "I've handled turbulence, mechanical failures, emergencies of every kind, but I've never seen anything like this. You were calm, precise. You saved this plane, saved all of them." Samantha shook her head weakly, overwhelmed. I just did what I had to," she murmured. Her mind still raced, replaying every violent pitch, every shudder, every blinding flash of lightning. The terror had not yet fully faded, but the relief, deep and overwhelming, was beginning to seep in. Ground crews surrounded the plane, attaching hoses, checking tires, securing the engines. Emergency vehicles lined the runway, lights flashing in the storm. Passengers were ushered off the plane in small groups, clutching bags, children, and loved ones. Their eyes often flicked toward the cockpit, where Samantha still sat, hands trembling but alive, the unsung hero of a story that would never be forgotten. Outside, the storm began to subside. Rain fell more gently, lightning streaks less frequent. The sun, barely visible through gray clouds, cast a dim glow over the tarmac. Samantha stepped out of the cockpit, her legs weak, knees trembling. Josh followed, still pale, staring at her with a mixture of awe and gratitude. The passengers who had made it off the plane gathered, murmuring thanks, hugs, tears. A mother handed her child to Samantha, tears streaking her face. You saved him," she said simply. "Saved all of us." The child clung to Samantha's leg, looking up with wide, innocent eyes. Samantha's heart swelled, and for the first time since the flight began, she allowed herself a real, deep breath. Reporters and emergency personnel arrived shortly after, capturing footage, taking statements and documenting the near-miraculous survival. The story would go viral within hours. A passenger had taken control of a plane mid-flight after the pilots were incapacitated, navigating a violent storm and landing safely, saving hundreds of lives. The headlines would scream heroism, courage, and an improbable triumph over fear and nature. Samantha allowed herself to lean against the fuselage for a moment, taking it all in. Relief, exhaustion, disbelief, they coexisted in a dizzying mix. Her mind replayed the flight, every decision, every adjustment, every terrified glance from the passengers and crew. And then a strange feeling washed over her. Gratitude. Not for herself, but for the people who had trusted her, for the passengers who had kept faith, for the pilot who had guided her through fragments of knowledge and instinct. The pilot approached her, leaning on the cockpit railing. "You've changed my life today," he said quietly. "Not just mine, theirs, everyone on that plane. You kept your head when none of us could. Don't ever doubt that." Samantha managed a weak smile. I couldn't have done it without you," she said, "or Josh or the others." Her voice trembled. "I just stayed focused." Josh, standing beside her, shook his head. "You stayed focused. You flew a plane through a hurricane, a storm, and some mysterious radar shadow. You didn't just stay focused, you saved us all." He laughed shakily, disbelief and awe mixing in his tone. As the sun broke through the clouds, faintly illuminating the tarmac, emergency crews and passengers began to disperse. But Samantha lingered, looking back at the plane. It had been battered, scarred by the storm, yet it remained upright, alive, like them. A symbol of survival, courage, and the extraordinary resilience that ordinary people are capable of when faced with impossible odds. And as she walked away from 7C, finally leaving the plane behind, Samantha realized the truth she had learned in every violent jolt, every shudder, every heart-stopping second. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is acting anyway. The storm had tested them all. It had screamed, roared, and raged. But in the end, human determination, ordinary, extraordinary, and unflinching, had prevailed. Samantha would never forget the passengers' wide eyes, the pilot's exhausted but grateful smile, the subtle shift of adrenaline and hope that had carried them through. And the radar shadow. A mystery, yes, but a reminder that fear often lurks where understanding has yet to reach, and that bravery sometimes means facing the unknown and refusing to let it define you. In the days, weeks, and years to come, social media would share her story in hashtags, viral videos, and news headlines. Passenger saves plane in mid-air emergency would dominate the feeds. But Samantha, looking back, would remember something far more profound than fame or accolades. The trust, the courage, and the unshakable truth that she had faced the impossible and survived. And as the final light of the sun glimmered on the wet runway, she allowed herself one quiet, shuddering exhale. The plane, the storm, the fear, all of it behind her now. She had flown through terror itself, carried lives through chaos, and emerged on the other side forever changed.